This is your host, Eric Hacopian, and we're very pleased today to be joined by Noubar Afeyan, world-renowned entrepreneur, scientist, and philanthropist. Thank you, Mr. Afeyan, for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here, Eric.
Well, it will be amiss to have you on with us without asking you about the issues of the last few days, perhaps for the last week, which is this whole issue of the new COVID variant, the Omicron variant. What can you tell us about this emergence and what is going on with this, and what do we know about this particular variant compared to the other ones?
Sure. Well, look, we have been engaged for 18 months or maybe almost 2 years now in a battle all around the globe between a virus that is preying on our collective social nature and our immune system, which is fighting back. And in that battle, both behavior and technology has kind of helped the human side get better and better with vaccines and other approaches. And now we're seeing the virus respond with a version of itself that is trying to escape the immune system. And I say trying because that's not an easy task, because our immune systems have evolved for a very, very long time to be able to counteract these kinds of variations. So what we know about Omicron is that it is a substantially different variant than anything we've seen before. That's the potentially dangerous news. And I say that just to give a sense of it, that if on average the recent variants like the Delta and the Beta were 2 or 3 letters changed in the protein in the important part, this is 10 to 12 letters changed. And that's why the scientific community and the global health community has taken the threat seriously. On the other hand, it's also the case that 2 years ago, we didn't have any of the protections we have, and today we do, so that we have a large portion of the population now understanding how to protect themselves with masks and separation. And of course, with the vaccines getting more and more penetration, we are partially protected. And what we're doing as we speak is to evaluate just what effect this new variant has on the degree of protection from vaccines. And accordingly, if it's good enough, we'll say that. If it needs to be boosted further, then boosters become even more important. And in the worst case scenario, we're ready to develop a variant-specific vaccine, which we're quite sure will be able to tackle this challenge as well. And we're right in the eye of that storm. We just have no data that suggests which way this is going to go.
Well, I'm going to bring you, thank you for that answer, because it's obviously the news that's dominating the world today. One thing I was going to ask you, and I'm sure you have dealt with this all around the world, one of the issues we've had in Armenia, which is not untypical of the world, is a tremendous resistance, misinformation for people not to vaccinate, on the vaccines. And this has obviously caused tremendous problems, and it's literally costing us lives every day. It's to an extent where this efforts almost seem to be organized in the sense that they, it's like this constant mutation of different things that they come up with. And this has obviously had tremendous effect in Armenia. And there was polling many months ago, and I think these numbers have changed, in which 70% of people were reluctant to take the vaccine. Those numbers have come down, I'm sure, just because of education as time's gone by. People have the fear that people have of COVID. What is your opinion? What is the best way to counter this kind of information, misinformation? And can we make the case that, frankly, the medical world or your world has not really done a good job of explaining or dealing with this massive amount of misinformation out there?
Well, I think that your characterization is correct, in that the evidence on the ground is that people are choosing to not protect themselves and thereby suffer the consequences. It's about as simple as that. It's an active choice they're making, and they are being manipulated by misinformation and fear and also sometimes confusing information, kind of conflicting information. As to who is responsible to try to fix that, I think everybody is. We are at the level of the family, the churches, the schools are, other companies are, the government is locally and nationally. everybody is responsible for this because, as you said, just like in a war, if you watch somebody being affected and don't kind of intervene or take care of them and support them, you're part of the problem. You're complicit. So I would say the following. I mean, I think it stems from a kind of our attitude towards health to begin with, because I view, Eric, I work obviously in the health field the rest of my time, other than pandemic related. Generally, we resign ourselves to the fact that we're going to get sick and die. It is like such a simple statement. And so when we get diagnosed with a disease, we're fatalistic and we accept it, and then we kind of subject ourselves either to the consequences or to medication or surgery. But as a result, it doesn't seem like as much of a threat because we've gotten ourselves prepared that, well, if it's not this, I'm going to get that. Whereas when it comes to a vaccine, we look at it as something that we chose to put in our body, and we have a completely different level of fear of that than of the very disease. So what I tell when I was in Armenia in July, I met with all the heads of the medical university, and there was a great degree of skepticism in the room. It was remarkable, doctors. And I said to them, look, if you, on the one hand, say, what's the risk of a vaccine? And you can quantify that now, because we've given it to 800 million people, 1 billion people, just the RNA vaccine, let alone all the other vaccines. And on the other hand, not ignore the disease and accept it, but say, okay, what's the consequence of the disease? It's not even a close call. It's a 50 to 100 to 1 difference as to what the consequences are. But the problem is people evaluate the vaccine against no vaccine, right? And so they actually think that they can live without being impacted by the disease. And that's simply not the case. It's a question of time before which people will get the disease, no question. In fact, what I tell people who argue in a kind of a fearsome way with me and make their case, I say to them, look, if you're so sure, just go contract the disease. And if you're willing to do that, I accept your argument. But if you're not willing to do that, then you don't have a balanced decision-making process. You're afraid of a vaccine, but you welcome the disease. It just makes no sense. But people have to be questioning. People have to be coming to their own conclusions, and all we can do is help them.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to move to the portion of state policy. I've seen our health ministry, frankly, get a lot better over time in pushing this vaccination process. What do you think on the level of state policy Armenia can do to deal with this vaccine better? One, for people who actually who get COVID, and secondly, to essentially promote the vaccination process further and further so we can actually join our other European counterparts that are coming in at much higher percentages of vaccinations.
Look, I think that it's a combination of securing supplies, which we have now fortunately been able to do in a far greater extent than was possible, frankly, a few months ago, just because of the dynamics of how that worked and how the Western countries completely consumed from the companies that were in their own countries all of their output. I mean, one of the things that people never understood is that legally you could neither ship vaccine from Europe nor you could ship vaccine from the US anywhere before those countries and those regions allowed it legally to happen, and they just simply didn't until middle of this year. And so that wait was painful, but fortunately that seems to be resolving. And there's plenty of supply that we see all over the world right now, and it's going to increase dramatically. So it's gaining access. It's having the distribution system to be able to get it out there, because there are cold chain storage things to be ready for, and I think they're putting that and they have that in place. It's education, and it's somewhat policy as to whether you have the right to infect other people. And at the end of the day, if you want the right to infect other people, that's not any constitutional right that I know of, any more than you have the right to hit other people or kill other people. And so I think the government has to stand firm and say, yes, you have the right to be infected, but you don't have the right to infect other people. And that will necessarily restrict movement, restrict access to certain places, not as a punishment, but as protection to other people. That's the role of an elected government.
Well, that's somewhat going on right now, because I think the biggest boost in vaccinations came here because of work mandates, where workplaces and businesses essentially ask people to vaccinate, which is one of the driving forces of vaccination in Armenia now. I want to move on to away from the vaccine and away from the COVID issue, and I'm taking off your scientist hat and putting on your philanthropist hat. You have been involved with many different people, including Ruben Vartanian, on a lot of different projects in Armenia over the last 20 years, in the field of education and other different fields. And many people like you and others have actually done a great deal for this country. However, I like to look at things critically. I think when you look at, since I'm a diasporan myself, I can speak of this freely, more freely, and I would say I have come to the conclusion that systematically the diaspora failed Armenia over the last 30 years. Specifically in the one area which involved developing state institutions and essentially building a state infrastructure. Tell me what you think about that, or if you agree with me, disagree with me, and what your views are about what the diaspora's role has been or hasn't been over the last 25, 30 years.
Well, there's definitely a lot of kind of reflection that's gone on in the last period, because clearly what happened with the Artsakh war, what happened in the country itself over the last few years is not a good reflection on what all of us have done, diasporans, non-diasporans on the ground, because we've taken a major setback. I would say, Eric, as I look back at the 20 years where on average I was in Armenia 5 to 6 times a year for 20 years straight, and I've been involved, as you said, in a number of initiatives. A lot of them are economic development related in the South, in education, in health, etc. And so I've seen it from different angles. And what I've concluded is that probably if I had to do one thing over again, and it probably wouldn't have been successful, but nevertheless, it would have been to insist on day one with the powers to be at the time and since then, that the diaspora cannot be a spectator to the key decisions the country is making about its future, because it cannot be simply a charitable institution. And that's exactly what we collectively allowed ourselves to become. We became silent partners. We absolutely, even though a lot of work was done and research and investigation on what to do, what to suggest to do, none of that made its way into policy. There was no venue for that to happen. And you could have said, okay, what choice did we have? The answer is we could have said, not until you do that will we engage. And we didn't do that. And I think that allowed, and that's at the institutional level, the diaspora institutions, but also at the individual level. And look, the reason is because I at least grew up in Lebanon and then in Canada and the US with the fantasy of having a free, in quotations, motherland. Didn't do anything to achieve it. It was handed to us 30 years ago. And I felt the compulsion to just help engage, and no conditions, just go. And 30 years later, I realized that by attaching no conditions, particularly to have a constituency, a role of some sort in the dialogue, that was absent, Eric. And I think absent that, we in a way may have aided and abetted what resulted, whether it's the lack of institutions, whether it's the corruption that happened, whether it's any number of things, by our inaction. And by the way, we could have been rejected and we could have been thrown out. But I think that if generation after generation was thrown out, the country would have woken up and said, wait a minute, how are we going to access this diasporan potential if we don't include them? We allowed ourselves to be included without being included.
I'm going to move on to another issue, which, as you know, despite many of our problems, our economy is actually coming back somewhat strongly on all levels. And we're also seeing a very serious startup, tech scene, things along those lines. But the one thing that is clearly lacking in the country is any systematic efforts to bring science back. Now, you're a scientist yourself, and I think you understand the importance of that. I think Soviet Armenia itself was a very serious center of scientific research. Just on the sciences and the pure sciences, what can we do collectively to bring sciences, especially high sciences, back to Armenia?
So Eric, I think in the science technology area is definitely a very important part of the future of any country, and in particular Armenia, with certain limitations in other fields. This is definitely an area that we need to focus on. For that reason, about 4 years ago, we started the Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology, FAST. Through that, we've begun a fairly wide range of initiatives, whether it's through scholarships for graduate students, through connections to international scientists, creating networks for them, beginning to put the groundwork in place to create a big innovation campus over time, and really trying to figure out which subsets of science, whether it's in the nanotechnology area or machine learning, AI, or biotechnology, where we may have a unique opportunity given the resources we have externally and how much infrastructure it would take internally to be able to compete. So we've been doing the ground laying work, and I think that it has to be a combination of government level understanding of the importance of this, which starts with education, which starts with the type of conditions created for the professors who are dedicating their lives to the education of the next generation and the research capabilities they have. And then I think when that seriousness is shown, then you're going to get a lot of collaborations with Armenians and non-Armenians around the world who have expertise in this area. But again, these are all interconnected, Eric. No matter what the topic, I've come to the conclusion that any effort that excludes the government, tries to make small initiatives, will stay small and in hindsight to be judged as irrelevant. And I worry that right now is the time where we have to change our ways. And in science technology, it's an absolutely great example. We can't just keep talking about it. We have to have a consistent, coordinated strategy with the government doing its part so that the rest of the community can do its part.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to move on to something that is, I think, more reflective. The one thing that last year's war resulted in is many people looking at everything that we do critically. And that's a good thing. You want to see what's worked, what's failed, what is it that we could do better. And I come from a public relations political background. And what was very clear to me is that we have never told our story properly. And what I mean by that is, with all of our faults, we actually have a remarkable story. And we have spent too much time talking about our crucifixions and not enough time talking about our resurrections. How do you think, how would you retell the Armenian story, not just necessarily the Armenia story, but the Armenian story to the world?
Well, Eric, I agree with you completely. And you could imagine that in the last 18 months, despite not particularly wanting it, I've been given the opportunity to tell part of the Armenian story because it's an integral part of my story. And there have been many, many cases where I have pointed to the resurrection aspect of our story, namely survival and then revival all the way to thriving, as a motivator and a mindset that you often find in startups and in innovations where people have that struggle. Everybody basically is against you. You try to bring about change, and when it happens, it's directly rooted in that fighting spirit and the creativity that comes from surviving. And I think our creativity, our adaptability is a major asset of ours. And we don't tend to channel it to good use, except individually. But collectively, it seems like the word diaspora, coming from the word dispersion, is alive and well. We're giving those who perpetrated the crimes against us every single day a victory by staying dispersed, by staying fragmented, by staying deconstituted. In other words, what we need to do, I've talked about this a lot publicly, I believe that the single answer to reversing the genocide and its effect on the living, not the dead, is reconstitution. Because the biggest effect the genocide had is to fragment us. So I think we have that in us. And the way to tell the story is to say our life experience, our witness, is motivating us to actually do good and to give back. Aurora, as an initiative that we founded several years ago, is entirely rooted in the good that comes out of a massive bad. And so I just think we have to be examples through the way we act. Now, by the way, Eric, as you know, much within the Armenian community, there's not only skepticism about what we haven't done, but also skepticism about what we are doing. And so there's a lot of Armenians who think, why bother with these things? Why not just kind of help each other and leave the rest of the world alone? I think the rest of the world has to discover our story, has to relate to it, and it does when they hear it. And we've got a lot of work to do, but I agree with you. Pity is not going to cause people to help us thrive. Pity will help us survive. A lot more opportunity, inspiration is going to help people engage in helping us thrive. And we've done it before. We need to do it now again, because unfortunately we've been thrust into a survival mode again. And it's not going to happen if we just keep our head down and keep ourselves isolated from the whole world.
I agree with you 100% on that issue, especially about, you know, retelling your narrative and making common bonds with people. I think the people who are critical of your efforts and Ruben's efforts on that front are frankly not very sophisticated in their approach to things. I'm going to close with a general question. As you know, it's no secret that we're going through difficult political times, geopolitical times. Our government is engaged on some level, on and off, in negotiations, whether it's border demarcation, whether it is opening transportation routes, and we saw this recently in Sochi, and we're going to see it in a couple of weeks in Brussels. You're obviously not a political person, you're not a diplomat, but you have spent your entire life, you know, dealing with high-level negotiations with governments, businesses, on matters that are, you know, in the billions of dollars, or matters of state policy. If people would ask you, what is your general advice about what should be the approach of our government and our foreign policy establishment in the conversations that are going to be going on for the next couple of years in regards to Armenia and Artsakh, what would be your advice?
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to address that, because I completely agree with your preamble that I'm not speaking as a professional, but I'm speaking as a stakeholder in the outcome, as an Armenian and an active Armenian. So I care. If you care about the outcome, then you are part of the process. You have to be. So I want to say two things, if I may. One relating to the current negotiations and what's happening, and the second is the diaspora, because it's interconnected to me. I'm very worried that things might have unintended consequences if they go a particular way. As it relates to the Artsakh matter, I would observe that when the first Artsakh war happened, all of the world's countries stepped in and said, you cannot solve this by force. There has to be a period of peace, and the people need to demonstrate their ability to coexist. Unfortunately, calculations were made, which in hindsight have proven to be not necessarily the right ones, but in hindsight, that the more this goes on, the better for us. And we did not seize the moment after a few years of coexistence to actually resolve. But today, we are in the same situation in reverse. We have suffered a defeat at some level, and we are grieving, and we have major losses. And I think it would be appropriate for the world, but in any event, our policy, to reflect that need to have a period, 3-5 years, of demonstrated peaceful coexistence before some of these things are forced upon us. I do not believe, as one member of the Armenian nation, I do not believe that a forced solution will last. I do not believe in history that forced solutions, at least recent history, are going to yield peaceful coexistence. This issue will come back over and over, and that same principle that prevented a forced solution 25 years ago, I think should be in people's minds today. So that's one thing I would say, is that, you know, lines of demarcation, establishing borders, what we should be thinking about, in my humble view, is that we should create a line of separation, have the Russians who've stepped in to help us preserve peace, protect each side from the other, show that people can actually have respect to each other and coexist, and then start. Now, having learned a lesson that delay is not the best way to get an answer, we can get this thing addressed in a way that the Artsakh Armenian community can actually feel is legitimate and not forced upon them. So that's one general thought I have. So I worry a lot that a current, albeit elected government, representing not just the country but the nation, actually agree on things under the threat of a gun. We went through this 100 years ago. The treaty that established our borders with Turkey was extracted in a similar way. And here we are 100 years later arguing over borders, because that's not a lasting peace. And that's not a lasting peace vis-a-vis Turkey, and it won't be a lasting peace, in my view, vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. It's not the right international way of doing these, I believe. The second thing is the diaspora, Eric, and here I have even more concerns. I think that because of Armenia's making yet another calculated, in my view, mistake in hindsight of treating the diaspora as a bank account, but very little else, we now risk completely alienating the diaspora. The diaspora has neither been asked, consulted, discussed with at all. I have not met any head of an institution, any individual that would tell me, yeah, at least they're asking me secretly whether, not that they need permission, but if you don't give constituency during an event like this, why would you expect 3 years from now that people are going to come and build back schools and build back this and that? Because they're going to feel like, when it mattered, we didn't matter. And now that you made a set of decisions, we have to come and do our duty again without asking any questions. And I'm really worried that the diaspora will not take that trade. And I'm very, very worried that steps should be taken today so that at least there's a sense of a collective commitment to not only the present problem, but then also the future. So we keep working together in building a better future. So you might think these two things are unrelated, but what I see in front of me, I'll tell you, Eric, for your audience to understand how it feels with me sitting in Boston dealing with saving lives in the pandemic as much as I can, but seeing lives lost in Artsakh, I feel like for 25 years, at least the 20 years I went there, we had a tough situation and we were getting better and better and better. Right now, it feels like almost we've become a patient, somewhat in a coma, and we in the diaspora have to watch the patient hopefully survive the coma, survive a surgery, and there's nothing we can do. Not only are we not in any close to the hospital, we have no idea what's going on. And that feeling of helplessness, in my view, is gonna drop important roots into what the future looks like. And I worry about that, and I really hope that the leadership, both in the country and in various institutions, protect the important relationship and interdependence. I think it's being frayed massively.
Well, I appreciate your views on that. I think there's a level of, frankly, all of our institutions, including the state, are terrible in communicating anything. And frankly, if you're in the diaspora and you feel that no one's asking you anything, frankly, people here feel the same way. There's not an effort to bring the country together politically or communicate effectively about what policies are, what we're trying to achieve. So that's a complete fail as far as the political leadership goes across the board. I appreciate your time, Mr. Afeyan, and we all appreciate the work that you do, and thank you for joining us today and being on our program.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.
This was your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian. Thank you for joining us.